So the ideas that I'm exploring in this 12 days, I look at them much more fully in my online classes. So if you're interested in taking a class, there's a link for finding out about them pinned to the top of the chat in YouTube. And if you'd like to read the whole story of Art, son of Con, or hear me telling it straight through, I've put links in the description to where you can find those things. So let's get started. This is where we were with the story so far. Con, the High King, who rules from Tara, had been grieving for his dead wife. Meanwhile, a woman called Beikova had been exiled from the other world, and she'd been sent to live among the mortals of Ireland. But she set her sights on Con's son, Art. When Beikova pitches up on an Irish beach in a magical boat, the first person she meets is Con, and she asks him about Art, saying that she's loved Art from afar. But Con wants her for himself and commands Beikova to marry him. There's just one snag so far. There'll be more snags. Beikova has told Con that her name is Delvkive and that she's the daughter of someone called Morgan, the magician. So let's see how things go for the happy couple. Beikova agreed to marry Con. What choice did she have? He'd commanded it. But she put a condition on the marriage, and it was a hard one. She told him that she would only marry him if he banished Art from Ireland for a year. Con argued against this, but Beikova insisted. She said that surely things would be less awkward for all of them, considering her feelings for Art. And finally, Con agreed. Con and Beikova became man and wife, but in that year of Art's absence, things went badly in Ireland. The cattle were sickly, the crops failed, and if the grass was thin and poor, so were the people. Con consulted with his druids. It is because of the woman you call Delvkive that this has happened, they replied. She is not as she seems at all. You must banish her for the sake of your land and your people. But Con refused, and he told his druids to find some other way to end the famine. The druids conferred together, and the truth is they doubted whether there was another way to end the famine, but they had to say something. So this is what they told Con. You must find the son of a sinless couple, and his blood must be mingled with the soil of Tara, and in this way the famine may be ended. If you'd like to delve a little deeper into the topics in my videos, you might enjoy taking one of my online classes. You can find out more about them at the link which is on your screen now. You can also support my work on Ko-fi or by becoming a patron. You'll also find free content to read on my Patreon page and on my website. All the links are in the description. So shall we start with the question of human sacrifice? People are always terribly interested in the question of whether the Druids practiced human sacrifice. So for some modern pagans, especially neo-Druids, understandably, this subject gets quite emotive. In the modern era, human life is seen as sacred, and no one wants their ancestors or the people they take spiritual inspiration from to be taking human life in that way. It's interesting how we can say we reject Christianity. Not all of my listeners have said that, of course, but a lot of the pagan ones have. Yet at the same time, we can still be very wedded to some of its deeply embedded habits of thought. Whatever the reasons are, the idea that each human life is sacred and valuable seems to have grown dramatically over the past century or two. And especially that's become associated with Christianity in a lot of people's minds. What shocks us about human sacrifice is the taking of a life. What shocked the Romans or the medieval Christians about human sacrifice was primarily that pagan people were sacrificing humans to pagan gods. The fact is, the jury's still out for sure on whether the Druids practiced human sacrifice or whether it was just a rumor that kept re-emerging. There are statements about it from a few classical writers, and these tend to be hearsay rather than eyewitness, a way of othering people who are maybe seen as enemies or seen as exotic and barbarian. It makes a good story. It might be an excuse for a bit of ethnic cleansing. On the other hand, it's perfectly possible that the Celts did sacrifice people. If those same classical writers are to be believed, the Druids taught that some form of reincarnation or transmigration of the soul happened, and it doesn't seem to have been dependent on whether you lived a good life or not. The body might be killed, but not the spirit. Therefore, death was no big deal. But whether the ancient Druids did or didn't practice human sacrifice, the idea of human sacrifice in this particular story is probably there to give the story an air of pagan authenticity about the olden days when Conn lived. The only version of this story we have, so that's the version I'm working from, comes from an Irish manuscript called the Book of Fermoy. Now, the Book of Fermoy is 15th, 16th century, so that's the very end of the medieval period. Now, that doesn't mean that some author sat down and composed this story out of thin air in the 15th century. The story of Art and Conn and Beicva might be very, very old, but the version that survives in the Book of Fermoy seems like it might have been written down from maybe an imperfect memory of an older story, or perhaps there were aspects of the story that the person writing it down didn't really understand. The truth is, we can't really get inside the head of this medieval scribe. We can't know what he did or didn't understand, whether he had an agenda beyond preserving the story the best way he knew how. What I can say is that this idea is going to work nicely to push the story forward as far as plot development goes. It's going to set us up for some interesting action in the coming days. It feels like an integral part of the story, even if it's not an original one. It's certainly well integrated into the story we have. So enjoy the story. Don't get too hung up on a corner of history we don't fully understand. Oh, well, that's out of the way. So there's something much more interesting going on in this section of the story, to my mind, and that's the famine. So a great deal of responsibility sat on the shoulders of Irish kings. They were expected to be very close to perfection. Everything from their physical appearance to their behavior should be as perfect as possible. For example, you might remember how Nuada, a king of the Tuatha De Danann, had to give up his kingship because he lost an arm in a fight. And this thinking doesn't make sense to us today. We see it as ableist, of course, but it was believed that every aspect of the king would be reflected in how things went in his kingdom. So this quote is from a book on the traditional Brehon laws of Ireland, and we can see how this expectation of perfection has been almost codified. It says that the king must be of good deeds, of good morals, exempt. I think that means he doesn't owe anybody anything, affluent and capable, no person not of age, in other words, too young, stupid, blind, deaf, deformed, or otherwise defective in mind or body, or for any reason whatsoever unfit to discharge the duties of the public position, or unfit worthily to represent the manhood of the community. So no such person could be chosen for king or could hold the kingship. Even a blemish on the face was a disqualification. And this is why it's important. The ideology of Celtic kingship held that it was a sacred institution in which the king as a representative of his human community, was married to the sovereignty goddess of the land. His good rule ensured prosperity for his people, while poor rule could sour his relationship with the divine, spoil the terrestrial condition of his people, and ultimately bring about his downfall. So a big part of our task in trying to understand the tangled web of this story we're working our way through lies in figuring out how it fits this paradigm of the king and the sovereignty goddess, and of the characters in this story, understanding who is who within that paradigm. In fact, I hope our study of this story will kind of raise your awareness of this idea more generally, because it comes up constantly in both Irish stories and Welsh stories. But you need to know about it in order to recognize it. An awful lot of the adventuring and elopement and wooing in Celtic myths ultimately comes down to kings and sovereignty figures. And one reason for that is that Celtic myth tends to be about the noble or elite class of society, kings and their families and how they interact with the gods, whose style and appearance tends to reflect the lives of the nobles. So I believe there's more to this than just a fascination with the rich and famous. As I said, a lot of responsibility rested with this king. He was kind of walking a tightrope. His health and success and behavior held the world in balance. So with that in mind, maybe it's time to define this word myth. So first things first. Lots of words have more than one meaning in our language, and sometimes this can cause problems. An American says football, and a British person hears the word and they picture what Americans call soccer. And there are problems like that surrounding the word myth. A common usage of myth in everyday conversation means something like something that's not true, like an old wives' tale, an urban myth. So that usage isn't wrong, but if it's the only way you ever hear the word used, then you might think of the word myth in a pretty negative way. That's just a myth. That's something we say if we want to dismiss what another person is saying as rubbish. So, like I said, this usage of the word isn't wrong, but myth originally meant something else. And that meaning is also still valid. And what people mean when they talk about Celtic myth or Celtic mythology, it doesn't mean a pack of lies or something only silly people believe. So this is the definition of myth that I use when talking about Celtic mythology or teaching it. Myths are stories people have believed for many generations, which cannot be fully confirmed, usually concerning their own origins, their culture, and gods. And these stories have a high degree of stability over time. In other words, they don't change very much or very fast. In an oral culture, these may be preserved by a recognized group of professionals. So let's break that down a little bit. Stories that people have believed for many generations. So obviously chemtrails and the idea that the moon landing was fake, stuff like that is recent. People haven't believed it for generations. It's just something that's going around. Whereas we can see that the stories we find in the medieval Welsh and Irish texts are very old, much older, and this is important, they're much older than the manuscripts in which they were written down. And these stories go deep into the culture, as this next bit says. They can't be fully confirmed. They aren't what we would call history, and yet in a way, they tell the story of a particular culture and its gods or other religious ideas. The stories have a high degree of stability over time. While that doesn't mean that they don't change at all, there is a tendency to treat them with a certain reverence and try and keep them alive. The ancient Celts, of course, they were famous for being an oral culture. They resisted the use of writing for things like their stories. Their bards and druids spent many years of their lives memorizing vast amounts of lore. They memorized poetry, they memorized stories, genealogies, the law, medical knowledge. The bards and fili and druids were the Celts' walking, living library of Alexandria. And although writing slowly took over in the medieval period, that attitude that things must be preserved, not through some kind of game of telephone or Chinese whispers, but through the hard graft of memorization by rote. Years of people's lives were dedicated to nothing but memorizing this stuff. Now, that's not to say it didn't change, but there's evidence that it didn't change very fast. This is the real magic of Celtic myth. There's a very slow distillation process over centuries, even over millennia. I see people wishing they could find the original version of a myth. They try to reconstruct an Indo-European myth or something. And in a way, I get that. But in a way, I'd say that many of the stories we have are not degraded or broken. They reflect many centuries of refinement by the people they belonged to. So we like to complain about the Christian scribes, but this was part of their culture too. So Art, son of Con, the story we're working with, may not be a great example of excellent preservation of a story. I think there are some problems with the text in the Book of Fermoy, but they're not insurmountable. So before we leave this, I just want to take a quick look at some of the story types that are adjacent to myths, because sometimes it helps us to define what a myth is by defining maybe what it isn't. Legends, stories that concern people who actually existed or real events, but which exaggerate or mythologize their characteristics. And these are usually things that happened quite a long time ago. Legends are usually about famous people or events which get bigger and bigger with the retelling. Sometimes they might eventually turn into myths, or at least that's one theory. So there's a theory that at least some of the gods in true myths started out as great kings or heroes or something like that, and their legends grew until they were revered as gods. I'm not personally convinced that that's what happened with Celtic myths, but I can't prove that it did or didn't. But I think what we can say is that characters like Art and Con in the Cycle of the Kings are treated in the stories almost as if they are gods, but only almost. So another kind of story type we have that's adjacent to mythology is folk tales. So these are stories about common people usually, and everyday problems. My milk has gone sour, whatever, I have no food to feed my children. These often include supernatural beings who are not deities. Fairies, selkies, water horses, giants. Folk tales are often preserved in families or in communities. They're often much more localized. There's often recognized and valued tradition bearers. Now, these aren't bards and feelies and druids, but nevertheless, there are people who are recognized in a community, and that's important. I just talked about the druids and the bards and the feeli, but there were, shall we say, lower classes of storytellers in Celtic society too. This might be an old person in a village who knew a lot of stories and probably gained some social currency by entertaining people. But many tradespeople were itinerant, people traveling along with goods for sale. Tailors were very important for making clothing, and they were often itinerant, and they would stay with people while they made the clothing that people asked for, even farm workers. And their stories were often in demand. They might start with the gossip from the next village, but many of them knew traditional stories, and some of them also knew mythological stories. But folk tales as I said, they tend to be about common folk, farmers and fishermen and women who can do magic, children who are stolen or orphaned. Very often they experience contact with the supernatural. Maybe they're cursed by a witch, maybe they're helped by the fairies, maybe they're eaten by a water horse. Sometimes it feels like certain kinds of folk tales are like scaled down versions of mythological stories. And there's a whole theory about that. So one theory says myths are scaled up folk tales or scaled up legends. And another theory says folk tales are scaled down myths. And there's some truth in all of that, I'm sure, but I don't think it's like there's one right answer for every story. So the Welsh stories about fairy brides who come out of lakes and marry farmers are an example of this. Those stories are like, they're like working class versions of the tales of kings and sovereignty goddesses. So you can see that these categories of stories will have some overlap. We can't completely ring fence myths and legends and folk tales and fairy tales. They bleed into one another. But we can still identify many stories as being myths because they are about gods, because they're about cultural origins, why we do things the way we do, that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean they're lies. It means that they're special and venerable.